One of the laziest forms of power is intellectual condescension. It is what weak people use when they want authority without accountability. They don't argue the facts. They downgrade the person noticing them. They call you emotional, reactive, insecure, dramatic, tired, overwhelmed, anything that allows them to step around the actual content of what you are saying. That tactic works disturbingly well in marriage because love makes many people generous long after generosity has stopped being safe. If someone you love looks at you with enough patience and says you're overthinking, a decent person will usually pause and inspect himself before pressing harder. That pause is often where manipulation moves in. It was certainly where it moved in with me. My husband didn't begin by hiding another life. He began by teaching me that my instincts were less respectable than his explanations. He framed my concern as temperament, my discomfort as fragility, my perception as an emotional weather pattern that would pass if I behaved like a more disciplined man. That was a real insult long before I had proof of anything. He wasn't just lying. He was reorganizing the meaning of my intelligence in the marriage. By the time I stopped arguing and started waiting for the evidence, the relationship had already shifted in a way he did not yet understand. The thought calling me emotional would keep me chasing his version of events. What it actually did was teach me to become quiet in a very different way. My name is Elias. I was 43 when my marriage ended, and if I sound calm about it now, that calm was purchased at a cost I would not wish on anyone, though I do not pretend it made me exceptional. It simply made me more exact. I live outside Seattle, and at the time this happened I worked as a senior brand strategist for a mid-sized outdoor apparel company. My job was HARF analysis and HARF storytelling, which meant I spent most of my days examining how people assign meaning to things and how easily perception can be guided by confidence, repetition, and selective framing. You would think that kind of work would make a man harder to manipulate at home. It does not always. Sometimes it just makes him more articulate when he doubts himself. That was one of my blind spots. I was self-aware enough to question my own reactions, but not yet self-respecting enough to recognize when someone had begun exploiting that quality. My husband, Nathan, was a corporate litigator. He lived inside precision the way some men live inside charm. He was not loud in the ordinary sense. He didn't need to be. He had the kind of composure that makes other people assume depth even when what they are really responding to is control. He spoke carefully, dressed well, kept his emotions arranged, and had a habit of listening with his head slightly tilted that made less certain people feel as if they were being taken seriously even when he was already preparing to dismiss them. That quality attracted me at first. I had grown up around louder men. My father loved us, but he came from a world where frustration was often treated like leadership if it happened at the right volume. Nathan felt different, more disciplined, more adult. That was a story I told myself early on, and it was not entirely false. The problem is that discipline without moral humility can become one of the most efficient forms of dominance there is. We were together 11 years, married for 8, no children. That was one of those modern absences that never arrives through one dramatic decision but through a series of postponements that eventually harden into structure. There was always a reason. Career timing, this trial calendar, my travel schedule, housing, financial priorities even after the finances were no longer the issue. Then eventually the idea itself acquired a kind of fragility. We stopped discussing it like an open question and began treating it like a room in the house we had both agreed not to enter without warning. That matters because unspoken things shape intimacy even when they are not the direct cause of its collapse. Silence can create peace, but it can also become the climate in which other forms of avoidance learn how to thrive. From the outside, our life looked enviably ordered. Nice house, good city, intelligent friends, decent vacations, the right kind of dinner parties where everyone talked just enough politics and food to feel cultured without exposing anything too raw. We knew how to host. We knew how to stand in photographs. We knew how to answer polite questions about work, travel, and how married life is treating you with a kind of smoothness that reassures other people more than it ever reassured us. That was part of the problem. We looked like the kind of couple who would recognize dishonesty too early for it to get very far. In reality, the structure of our life had become so aesthetically competent that it obscured how unequally emotional truth was being distributed inside it. If I'm fair to the truth, the imbalance began long before there was another man that lived in who got to define reality first. Nathan had a way of responding to my concern that made me feel, not crazy exactly, but less authoritative than I should have felt in my own marriage. If I was heard, he often asked whether I was tired. If I was uneasy, he asked whether something at work was making me project more than usual. If I pointed out a tonal shift or something that felt off, he rarely denied it directly. He did something subtler. He widened the issue until my perception looked imprecise inside it. Maybe he had been distracted. Maybe I was especially sensitive that week. Maybe I was taking ordinary marital friction and adding emotional symbolism because I processed through feeling first. That last phrase was one of his favorites. It sounded respectful. It was not. It was taxonomy, a way of sorting my instincts into a category that made them easier to outrank. That is where I have to be critical of myself. For too long, I mistook my willingness to self-examine for maturity even when self-examination had become structurally one-sided. I was proud of being emotionally literate, proud of not being the kind of man who demands certainty from every discomfort. But there is a line where introspection stops being wisdom and starts becoming a subsidy for someone else's manipulation. I crossed that line because I wanted to be fair. Fairness, I have learned, becomes dangerous the moment it is no longer mutual. The first outward changes were ordinary enough to insult me in hindsight. Nathan started staying later at the office, wishing his profession was entirely plausible. Trial prep, client dinners, partner meetings, strategy sessions, emergency filing windows. All the rituals of legal urgency were available to him, and he knew how to weigh them convincingly. But it was not the late nights themselves that bothered me. It was what came home with them, or rather what didn't. He stopped arriving in texture. He used to tell me stories from the office, ridiculous partner behavior, a judge with an ego too large for the courtroom, some junior associate who had sent an email so catastrophically ill-judged it became legend by lunch. Those stories vanished. His days came home flattened. How was the dinner? Lie. How did the prep call go? Fine. You seem distant. I'm tired. Nothing about those answers would disturb a stranger. But marriage is not a stranger's experience. It is made of repeated emotional access. When the access narrows and narrows and narrows, something has changed, whether the other person chooses to name it or not. Then his tone sharpened, not openly. Nathan was never vulgar with language. He did not need to be. He became more dismissive around ordinary questions. If I asked when he thought he'd be home, he might say, "I already told you I don't know," with just enough patience in the sentence to make my repetition feel childish. If I asked whether we were still seeing my mother for brunch Sunday, he would exhale and say, "Does every social commitment have to become a formal logistics plan with you?" Again, small things. But contempt survives best when it enters in forms that still let the target wonder whether he's simply being too delicate. I brought it up early enough that I sometimes think the marriage could still have been salvaged if honesty had mattered more to him than control. We were in the kitchen one night, late, both still in work clothes. I said, "You felt real far away for a while." He looked up slowly from the mail he was sorting and asked, "Far away how?" Emotionally. There was a pause. Then the familiar tilt of the head. "Elias, I think you experience stress as intimacy loss faster than most people do." That sentence is still one of the most insulting things anyone has ever said to me, precisely because of how polite it was. He wasn't answering me. He was diagnosing me. "I'm not asking for a theory," I said. "I'm asking if something changed." He folded a utility bill in half, very neatly, and said, "Not everything that feels heavy to you means something is wrong. There's a difference between heavy and dishonest." That got his attention. He looked at me then and said, "This is what I mean. You go to suspicion very quickly when you're emotional." Emotional. There it was. Not the first time he'd used the word, but the first time I truly heard the hierarchy inside it. Emotional meant less reliable than me, less disciplined, less objective, easier to dismiss without looking cruel. I let that conversation die there because I was not yet ready to admit what had already begun. That was my failure. Not that I trusted him, that I trusted the framework he had built around my reactions long after it had stopped being fair. The first name that started surfacing too often was Graham. He was, according to Nathan, a corporate consultant attached to a merger case. Smart, annoying. One of those men who thinks expensive glasses are a personality, Nathan said once, which should have told me more than it did. Attraction often enters marriage disguised as amused irritation. Graham began appearing everywhere in his stories. Graham had a good instinct for judge assignments. Graham knew the other side's counsel. Graham was still at the office after 9. Graham had flown in again. The repetition itself mattered. The vagueness mattered more. Hidden people are often brought into the home not by concealment but by controlled familiarity. Enough to normalize them, not enough to make them emotionally visible. I asked once lightly, over coffee on a Saturday morning, "You mention him a lot." Nathan smiled. "Do I?" "Yes. Well, he's in half my life right now. It would be strange if I didn't." Then he looked at me, already half amused, and said, "Please tell me this isn't where you're going." There is an art to making another person feel embarrassing before he has even fully voiced the question. Nathan was very good at that art. I shrugged and let it go. Or at least I let him believe I did. The first direct signal came through a message preview. Not dramatic. That is important. I do not believe the truth usually announces itself theatrically. It leaks. It frays. Nathan had left his phone in the bathroom while showering before a client dinner. I was brushing my teeth when the screen lit up on the counter. "I still think about your hands." That was a message. No name. Just the line. When he came out, I asked, "Who's texting you about your hands?" He did not panic. That is one of the things that frightened me more than panic would have. He looked at the phone, then at me, and gave a short laugh. "It's from Grace." Grace, a partner's wife. We were talking at the fundraiser last week and I helped her with a ring clasp that got caught on her dress. "That's a strange text." "You're making it strange." "From an unsaved number." She got a new phone. Jesus, Elias. There it was again. Not the answer. The correction of my response. His face carried that same cultivated disappointment, as though the true problem was not what I had seen but the social quality of my noticing it. "I'm asking because it matters." "No," he said quietly, "you're asking because you're in a mood and this gives you something to attach it to." That line worked on me more than I want to admit, not because I believed him, but because it reactivated the entire structure he had spent years building. The possibility that I was the one making things heavier than they were. The possibility that my emotional perception had become self-confirming. Manipulation succeeds best when it borrows your own self-awareness as its instrument. For about 2 weeks after that, he softened. That pattern matters. He asked more about my day. Suggested we go away for the weekend. Touched my low back when passing behind me in the kitchen. Initiated sex after a noticeable stretch of indifference. That would have comforted me once. By then it felt too timed, too aware of what it needed to quiet. Sudden tenderness after suspicion is often not intimacy. It is maintenance. The discovery happened because of the shared tablet, though not in the way people usually imagine. Not because the full thread was sitting there open in some convenient act of fictional carelessness. Nathan was too disciplined for that. He deleted the messages on his phone. He even cleared the primary thread on the sync device. What he forgot was that the tablet stored recent message notifications in a sync backup pane for 48 hours before the operating system purged them. I found it on a Wednesday evening while trying to reconnect the tablet to our printer. The message pane had glitched, and I opened the cache notification view without intending to. There they were. Fragments. Not full conversations. But enough. Yesterday shouldn't have ended in the car. He's too emotional to notice timing. Delete this one too. The hotel bar was a mistake. Miss your mouth. And then the line that made the entire thing morally complete. You were right about him. He feels everything before he proves anything. That was the sentence that changed me, not because it revealed a new fact, but because it revealed the philosophy under the fact. Nathan had discussed me, studied me, reduced me. My emotional life, which he had spent years gently framing as excessive, had become part of his operational strategy with another man. That is the difference between weakness and contempt. Weak people lie. Contemptuous people turn your character into infrastructure for the lie. I took screenshots. Then I checked the phone records under our family plan. Repeated calls to one number during late prep nights. I checked his email on the shared account login. Hotel reservations masked as client meeting overnights. Local parking receipts on evenings he claimed to be at the office. A gift receipt from a boutique menswear store, silver tie bar, monogrammed. Not my initials. That was enough. I did not confront him. Not because I was afraid. Because I no longer wanted the version of truth that came through his mouth. I wanted structure. Sequence. Something solid enough that his tone could not rearrange it. That is the silent response people misunderstand. Silence is not always passivity. Sometimes it is the point where a person stops donating emotional energy to someone else's performance and starts acting on what he already knows. I met with an attorney named Martin Kell 2 days later. He reviewed the screenshots, the call logs, the receipts, and asked the only question that really mattered. Do you want to keep this marriage? No. Do you want to confront him today? No. What do you want? I answered with more clarity than I had felt in months. I want to stop being the man he has been describing to someone else. That became the principle of everything that followed. Over the next 3 weeks, I gathered financial records, copied mortgage documents, separated personal funds, and secured a furnished rental through a friend who traveled for 6 months out of the year. I moved the irreplaceable things first. Passport, family photos, my grandfather's watch, legal papers, then clothes, then the practical things people don't think about until they matter. Prescription records, spare chargers, insurance copies, my grandmother's old coffee grinder. That is what ending a marriage looks like in the real world. Not speeches. Inventory. Meanwhile, Nathan grew more comfortable. That is what arrogance does once it thinks the danger has passed. He became more dismissive, not less. One evening, when I asked whether he'd be home in time for dinner with friends, he said, "You know what your problem is." I looked at him. You think emotional certainty is the same thing as insight. That line might have wounded me earlier. By then it only interested me. He was still speaking to the old version of me, the one who would defend himself against his framework instead of working out of it. I said, "No. My problem was letting you define what my perception meant for too long." He laughed, but not well. "There you go again. Gun," as if my clarity were a recurring personal flaw rather than a response to his conduct. The turning point came because he still believed he had time. That was his mistake. He thought deleting the messages would save him because he thought evidence was a real risk. It wasn't. The real risk was that I had stopped needing him to make sense. Once that happened, his control over the narrative shrank faster than he understood. I confronted him on a Sunday afternoon after signing the lease on the rental and moving the last of the essential documents out. The house was quiet. Rain against the back windows. No audience. I did not need one. By then the truth was already stable enough inside me. He was reading in the den when I asked him to sit at the dining table. He looked mildly irritated. "In this way?" "No." That word changed the room before the evidence ever did. I put the tablet on the table first. Then the screenshots. Then the hotel receipts. Then the gift invoice. He looked at the documents in silence for longer than I expected. Not because he was confused. Because for the first time, I think, he understood that his usual tools had arrived late. Finally he said, "You went through my things." I nodded. "I went through the lie. That is a violation. So is teaching another man how to interpret my character while you sleep with him." That landed. Part. He tried to widen the issue, said the marriage had been strained, said he felt unseen, said I led with emotion too often for him to be honest without chaos. That last line almost would have impressed me if it weren't such a pure expression of cowardice. Imagine betraying someone and then calling his emotional aliveness the reason you preferred deceit. I said, you didn't lie because I was emotional. You lied because calling me emotional gave you a cleaner story about yourself. That was the truth. Not the whole truth perhaps, but the essential one. Then I took the rental key from my pocket and placed it beside the tablet. He stayed at it. What is that? It's where I'm sleeping tonight. That was a power reversal. Not because I dominated him. Because the truth had finally become independent of his explanation. He could no longer salvage control by sounding calmer than I did. Structure had upfront performance. He asked, you're really leaving? Yes. Over this? No, I said. Because of what this required you to believe about me in order to keep doing it. That was the part he could not answer. He cried after that. Real tears, I think. Or at least real fear. But tears matter less when someone has spent too long using your better qualities as the architecture of their dishonesty. I do not say that cruelly. Just accurately. I left that night. The divorce was not dramatic. It was expensive, bureaucratic, quiet in the way adult devastation often is. The household, counts separated. Holidays became negotiations. Friends sorted themselves according to their own comfort with truth. Graham disappeared quickly, which told me exactly what that connection had really been worth once secrecy stopped flattering it. A year later, I saw Nathan once in an airport restaurant in Chicago. He looked composed, a little thinner, still elegant in the way men like him always seem to remain elegant even after their moral life has become small. He asked if he could sit down for a minute. I said yes. He told me he was sorry, that he had been arrogant, that he had underestimated what he was doing, that he had mistaken my restraint for emotional excess instead of discipline. That last sentence was the closest he came to real honesty. I listened and then said, you didn't think I was too emotional to understand. You thought I was too emotional to act without your permission. He looked down after that and said nothing. That was enough for me. So if there is a message in this story, it is not that evidence solves betrayal. Evidence only clarifies it. The deeper lesson is that underestimation is one of the most corrosive forms of arrogance in intimate life. The moment someone starts treating your emotions as proof that your perception is less valid than theirs, you should become very careful about what kind of power they are trying to preserve. People do not call you too emotional because they are always stronger. Sometimes they call you too emotional because it is the easiest way to make your instincts negotiate with their comfort. My husband said I was too emotional to understand. What he forgot was that emotion does not prevent a man from seeing clearly. Sometimes it is the reason he knows exactly when to stop pretending he doesn't.